how many of you feel that you're familiar with the problem of climate change? Can you put your hand up very high if you're very familiar, kind of in the middle if you're not too sure? Yeah, okay, so I think everybody's reasonably familiar with the concept, but I will give us a quick refresher. I think it's always nice to be reminded about the problems that we are facing. Do I just click on there? Okay. Brilliant, yes. So as Amanda rightly said, climate change, I would say, is the greatest challenge of our time. So the climate has always varied due to natural factors, but now it's human activity associated with our modern life that is overriding this natural variability and triggering changes that are happening faster than ever before. So the main problem is that burning fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas to generate energy releases what we call greenhouse gases, principally carbon dioxide, also others. These concentrate in the atmosphere, warm the planet. It's actually very simple chemistry and physics. And cutting down forests, clearing vegetation has the same effect, because forests, as we all know from our school science, absorb carbon. So if you chop them down, they release it. It's actually quite simple. So since the industrial age started around the 1800s, accelerated in the 1900s, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which you see in the first graph, has risen by nearly 50%. This is something we can actually measure. We physically take the atmosphere and measure it. There's no controversy. And average temperatures have risen by more than 1 degree since the Industrial Revolution around there. And this is a graph taken from the latest scientific report of the United Nations. Now, what is this doing? As Amanda said, it's triggering changes in the climate. And these are no longer a distant prospect. They're happening right now. I've taken 4 photos here from various climate extremes you might have been aware of. Typhoon Rai in the Philippines recently, the heat dome over Western Canada and the US, floods in Germany, and wildfires in Greece. I could have stacked this slide full of other photos, as you'll be aware. So what can we do about it? Once again, in principle, it's quite easy. So essentially, to stabilize global temperatures, we need to bring down our emissions of greenhouse gases to what we call net zero. The net is there because we can't eliminate them entirely, but we need to bring them down to as close to zero as we possibly can. Again, we're talking mostly about carbon dioxide. To do this, we need to halt and reverse deforestation and to stop consuming fossil fuels, starting with coal, also oil and gas, almost completely. And renewable energies, wind, solar, geothermal, tidal, these will need to fill the gap. We'll have to consume less energy. Energy demand will have to fall. We can do that through greater efficiency, more green technologies, and we'll need changes in other economic sectors too. So just to point out on this slide, we have a picture of Sheringham Shoal, which is a large offshore wind farm off the coast of Norfolk. Some of you may have seen it. These are actually solar panels from my own garage, which is quite fun. And this is the largest concentrated solar power plant in Morocco. Absolutely incredible thing. So the solutions are there. The question is, we need to do them. And it's best to implement our solutions in a coordinated way, with cooperation between countries. There's no point Cambridge or the UK cutting its emissions down to zero if our neighbouring country continues to burn coal regardless. There is no point doing that. Plus, because we live in a global economy, is obviously much more efficient if we all adopt coordinated action, much cheaper if all countries work together. Now, that's clear, that's obvious, and that's why more than 30 years ago now, the UN General Assembly decided to launch global talks on how best to address climate change. And since then, so governments have adopted 3 climate change treaties. I've listed them here. You may well have heard about the Paris Agreement that was adopted in 2015. There was quite a splash there. We can see former President, US President Barack Obama played a very important role in Paris. Going backwards here, we have Vice President Al Gore with Japanese Prime Minister Hashimoto at the time in Kyoto for the Kyoto Protocol, and former US President George W. Bush signing the Climate Change Convention at the Rio Earth Summit in '92. I'm not sure why I've ended up with 3 US presidents. Maybe that's saying something. So the Paris Agreement, as I say, you may well have heard of it, is the most recent climate change treaty, the one that really applies now. It established a global goal of limiting warming to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and preferably 1.5. If you think back to my previous chart, we're at 1, touching 1.1 right now, so that's an ambitious goal indeed. So to do that, every government, and pretty much every government has signed and is now a party to the Paris Agreement, every government must pledge its own national emissions target and action plan, and it's supposed to update and strengthen this every 5 years. And that's backed up by quite a comprehensive system of reporting data and reporting on policy implementation. Now, as well as that, the richer countries, there's a list of them, are supposed to, and they do, provide funding to poorer developing countries to help them move onto a greener development path and to help them adapt to climate impacts. And there as well, a target was set that would provide $100 billion a year to developing countries. That's supposed to be achieved by 2020. Now, I know it sounds like a huge amount of money, but actually it's not. It's actually quite small compared to what is needed. So every year since 1995, governments have met in what is known as the COP, which stands for the Conference of the Parties, to review how things are going with the climate change treaties, and potentially to adopt new rules and regulations to strengthen the response. So the Glasgow Climate Conference was COP26, the 26 such annual meetings. And these are held throughout the world. Maybe you may see your country represented here, and countries bid for the privilege of hosting the COP. So in total, there are 195 countries roughly who have signed up to the climate change treaties and who are therefore represented by delegations at the COP. There can be anything from a dozen people on a delegation through to hundreds. You can see here the activity that ensues. And it can be a very messy process trying to reach agreement among all these different delegations who speak different languages. Of course, there is some interpretation, but it's not always there. These people come from different political cultures, and they often feel they have different interests. So, I mean, I think it's true to say that all governments agree that climate change is a serious problem and they want to do something about it, but they do profoundly disagree on what should be done, and most importantly, on who should do it. So the poorer developing countries, I'm thinking about African nations here, about small island states who stand to be submerged by sea level rise. They are very vulnerable to these weather extremes. So these countries are pushing for rapid action, especially from the richer world, and generous financial support. But many other countries, especially larger emerging economies, are very worried about the costs of transitioning to a greener economy. And some oil exporting countries, notably Saudi Arabia, have even tried to obstruct the negotiations because they're so worried about the loss of revenue if we move to a world that's powered by green energies and not oil. So let's turn to Glasgow itself. So these are media headlines taken from the months running up to the conference, and you can see that there were very high expectations were placed on Glasgow. There was very much a kind of end of times apocalyptic narrative surrounding it. And you can kind of see why that was, basically because time is genuinely running out. So there has been some progress, definitely, over the past 30 years, but it has been far too slow. And as you can see from the first graph, global emissions of greenhouse gases are still rising. They've risen by about 60% since governments first started meeting to try and tackle the problem. There's been some slowing down, but they are still rising. And especially if you compare this to what needs to be done. So to level out at 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming, this is the steep decline that is needed now. The blue one is to achieve 2 degrees and the red one is 1.5. So if you compare those two graphs, you can see the kind of daunting undertaking that we have before us. I would say largely because we haven't taken enough action in the past. This is actually what we've come to. So there were very high hopes that the Glasgow conference could really accelerate progress and move us more onto this kind of track here. So did it succeed in this task? Okay, so let's look at what happened and then we can assess this together. So overall, I would say it was a positive and constructive conference. So it certainly exceeded my expectations. I mean, I've been following this kind of stuff since 1995, and some climate conferences in the past have dramatically collapsed or basically failed to deliver anything of any significance, including the last COP, which was in 2019. We skipped 2020 because of COVID. There was a lot of drama, some heated debates you might have seen on the news, but by and large, there was a reasonably good atmosphere and a spirit of compromise. You can see some delegates celebrating their wonderful achievements there. And in particular, it was actually very encouraging to see the US and China working constructively together. So as we all know, diplomatic relations between China and the West, especially the US, the UK, are quite strained at the moment. We know that. But the two delegations in Glasgow decided to separate out climate change from their wider disagreements and focus on climate change as a uniting global problem. And obviously that's very important because China and the US are the two largest emitters of greenhouse gases, accounting for about 40% of global emissions together. So we can't do anything without them individually and without their cooperation. So it's very good news if they're willing to work together on this problem, despite their wider disagreements. Now, it was also really good to see record participation in Glasgow. So despite the pandemic, it was the biggest COP ever, with nearly 40,000 people attending. And now these included not just the government delegates, but also the media and thousands of representatives from civil society, from faith groups, from businesses, from trade unions, philanthropies, ordinary people outside the conference centre marching in the streets, and many came from thousands of miles away. And I think this shows that understanding and awareness of climate change is growing throughout society. And I should also say it was very good there was no major COVID outbreak in Glasgow. I think that was a real concern. In fact, I decided not to go in the end because I was just too worried about it. I followed it online, but no, it all seems to have passed off reasonably well. I should say the UK government went to tremendous lengths to try and avoid an outbreak. They had a vaccine offer for delegates in their home countries. There was daily testing. It was quite a strict regime, and it seems to have paid off. Okay, but let's look at the actual decisions. So the most important decision was what was called the Glasgow Climate Pact, which was basically the final conference declaration, setting out the common views and intentions of all the governments. Everything has to be adopted by consensus. So if you have a decision, everybody agrees to it. So this pact was actually very encouraging in displaying a real sense of urgency. So the word urgent is mentioned 11 times in this document. And what it also shows is a shift in emphasis towards the goal of 1.5. So you remember I said the Paris Agreement had two goals, 2 degrees and preferably 1.5. Now it seems the whole world is united towards 1.5. So that was a really important outcome of Glasgow, not least because climate impacts at 1.5 are considerably less than at 2. So for example, if we do manage to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, that could actually mean saving the coral reefs. At 2 degrees, the coral reefs are gone. But at 1.5, there is a chance that some of them can live on. So perhaps the greatest achievement of the Glasgow conference was in pushing governments to pledge more ambitious climate plans. You'll remember I said that under the Paris Agreement, governments have to update and strengthen their climate plans every 5 years. So the first update was due in Glasgow, actually the year before, but because of COVID, it was postponed. And actually it was really promising to see that the vast majority of governments did take that requirement seriously. So on this map, you will see all the countries in blue are ones whose updated climate plan is actually stronger than the one before, okay? In orange, they're either the same or a few countries has actually gone backwards. But mostly you can see most countries, their new climate plan is stronger than the one before. I mean, if you've got specific questions about some of these, I can talk about them. It's interesting. So countries like Brazil and Australia, they submitted new climate plans that they said was more ambitious than the one before. But when the number crunchers looked at the detail, the way they'd changed the baseline, including this, not including that, it actually was, pretty much the same or underneath. And that's slightly the problem with the Paris Agreement, is that you can pledge kind of whatever you like. So it's quite difficult to compare the different targets. But luckily nowadays, we do have a lot of universities like Cambridge, like others, who really dig down, and they're able to produce these kinds of assessments. Now, in addition to stronger climate pledges, these are mostly short-term for 2030, a large number of countries have now submitted net zero targets, so targets for cutting their emissions all the way down to net zero by around 2050. Most of them are for 2050. And all those coloured there, so not the ones in grey, all those coloured there do actually have net zero targets in place. And this is actually, I think, a really big achievement when you even have countries like Saudi Arabia, like Russia, like Australia, who are well known for really dragging their feet on climate change. Even these have net zero targets in place. And the big surprise, and indeed achievement, was that India also pledged a net zero target. Now, why is that important? India is the third largest emitter. And up to now, it's really resisted making ambitious commitments because, as it rightly says, it still has a large proportion of its population living in real poverty, and that should be its priority. But now it seems as an acknowledgement that it is possible to alleviate poverty and grow, but still using green energy, that we don't need to burn coal to alleviate poverty. And that's the kind of message that a net zero target from India conveys. So that was really good news. Now, if we add all these pledges together, the really good news is that it could take us to below 2 degrees and tracking 1.5. So the first bar there shows us what all the existing pledges added up to in 2020. And we were around 2.6 degrees, which would be really catastrophic. That there's a range of uncertainty, of course. And now we're down to about 1.8. So that is good news, and that is due to the climate change process under the UN and to the convening power and to the political boost of Glasgow. So that is good news. Glasgow also registered other breakthroughs, and the most high profile of these was that countries agreed to phase down coal as a source of power. So coal is the most polluting of all the fossil fuels, yet it still accounts for about a quarter of global energy consumption. Now that share is falling, but there are many countries, especially in Asia, who are still building and planning coal-fired power plants. So the commitment in Glasgow to phase down coal power could be really significant. And it was the first time that a specific fossil fuel has actually been mentioned in a decision of the COP. You might find that a bit surprising, but that just shows the politics of the process. So these are mostly the good news. As you'll expect, there'll be a but to all this. So let's look at where Glasgow fell short. And I think the main disappointment was in its failure to really provide an uplift on finance for developing countries. So you might remember I mentioned this collective target of providing $100 billion a year in funding to developing countries. That was supposed to happen by 2020, but it wasn't. It was missed. It's about 83 billion. There's a lot of debate about what counts as funding or not, but for sure, that target was missed, partly because the US has been absent from the climate change debate under President Trump. So that would account partly for that. And President Joe Biden has been trying to make up the shortfall, but he also faces obstacles in the US Congress. So the point was that the larger donor countries weren't able to make significant new pledges also in Glasgow. So this was a disappointment, but new talks have been launched on a higher target for post-2025, and there are lots of pledges, of money to come. But that is always a difficult issue in the negotiation, is funding for developing countries. So another disappointment was that although governments agreed to phase down coal, they almost completely ignored oil and gas. So these are two other fossil fuels that are major contributors to climate change, lesser than coal, that's true, but their consumption, especially of gas, is continuing to rise. So it was interesting that two small countries, so Denmark and Costa Rica, they sponsored a declaration, this Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which would have committed signatories to end new exploration and extraction. So it wasn't asking countries to stop what they're doing now, but to end any new exploration. But it was only able to attract a very small number of signatories, countries here, most of which hardly have any oil or gas exploration anyway, to be honest. And it was interesting, actually, that the UK did not feel able to sign up to this, even though it was presiding over the conference. And in the end, there was quite a big kerfuffle, nor did Scotland, which I think was a slight source of embarrassment to Nicola Sturgeon. I'm not sure what was going on there, but Scotland wasn't able to sign up to this. So I think the point here is that if governments are going to limit warming to 1.5, it is scientifically imperative to start phasing down oil and gas now. Yeah, that's not controversial. That is mathematically true. So there's still a real contradiction in what governments are promising and what they actually plan to do, let alone what they're actually doing. Okay, but on balance, and I do like to be positive, we can say that Glasgow did pretty well in the circumstances. Governments seemed more united than they have been for many years, a much stronger sense of urgency, and most did tighten their climate plans, which are more in line with 2 or 1.5. The pledge to phase down coal, I think, is also very significant, but there were these disappointments that I mentioned and that I summarize here. But of course, we all have to bear this warning sign in mind. All these successes, these signs of progress that I have pinpointed, they all depend on implementation by governments back home. At the moment, they are just words printed on paper, just promises. It's the implementation that really matters. And because of the nature of international law and of the Paris agreements, there is no real enforcement if promises are not met. There is name and shame, and that can have more impact than you might think, but there are no financial penalties, nobody will go and impose sanctions, nothing like that. Okay, so these are things that we absolutely have to bear in mind. On the plus side, it's interesting how most of the time governments do implement what they commit to internationally. They tend to commit to weaker targets, but ones they actually plan to implement. But here we do need to see what happens in the future. And this is why I wanted to leave you with this. I I don't know how many of you are non-Anglophones, but we do have the saying in English, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So in a sense, we won't really know if Glasgow has been a success for a few years to come, and it'll really depend on what governments do with their promises when they go home. And the whole COP thing continues. So this year, COP27 will take place in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and I'm sure delegates will be very happy to have a COP on the Red Sea coast rather than in Northern Europe. But this process continues, and I hope with this talk, you'll be well equipped now. When you hear about climate change or the COP in the news, you'll have a better understanding of what it's all about. So I'll leave it there if there are any questions. Thank you.